The sawdust never really went away. No matter how many times I swept the floor of my workshop, there was always a fine layer of it left behind, pale and soft, settling into the grooves of the old wood floor, like it belonged there. Elaine used to say that a man who works with his hands leaves a part of himself everywhere he goes. I used to laugh at that. I wasn't laughing much anymore. It was the last Friday of October, and the Tennessee sun was doing what it always does in autumn, pulling itself down behind the ridgeline, early, staining everything copper and rust before letting the cold move in. I had been standing at my workbench for the better part of an hour, running a hand plane along a piece of white oak that didn't need any more planing. But the motion kept my hands busy, and keeping my hands busy kept everything else at a manageable distance. My name is George Calloway. I am 73 years old. I own 40 acres of bottomland corn outside Cookeville, Tennessee, in a small lumber operation my father started in 1961 with a used sawmill, and what he called a stubborn refusal to work for anyone else. For 38 of those years, I had someone worth coming home to. Her name was Elaine. She passed 5 months ago on a Wednesday morning in May, with the windows open and the smell of the cornfield drifting through on a soft breeze. The doctors had given us 8 months from the diagnosis. She made it 10. That was Elaine. She never did anything on anyone else's schedule. I looked through the small window that faces the back of the house. The kitchen light was on. Through the glass, I could see the table. 2 chairs. The one nearest the window with the slightly worn armrest where she used to rest her left elbow while she read was empty. It had been empty for 5 months. I still couldn't look at it straight on. The hardest morning wasn't the day after the funeral. People fill that day up for you casseroles on the counter voices in the hallway. The hardest morning was 3 days later when the house went quiet and I walked into the kitchen at 6 and started the coffee without thinking. I filled the pot. I set out 2 mugs. I put 1 teaspoon of sugar in the mug on the right the way I had done every morning for 38 years, and I stood there with the spoon in my hand staring at what I had just done. The coffee brewed, the kitchen filled with that familiar smell, and I watched the second mug sit there until it went from hot to warm to cold. I never touched it. Elaine Grace Calloway was not a sentimental woman. She was precise and deliberate, with a quiet intelligence that could see around corners most people didn't know were there. She kept our finances in a leather ledger since 1992. She remembered every birthday in the county without writing them down. She never did anything without a reason. Every choice she made, down to the smallest ones, had thought behind it, which is why I should have paid closer attention when I reached up to the shelf above my workbench and my hand landed on her Bible. It was an old King James, dark brown leather, the spine worn smooth from decades of her thumbs, working along it during Sunday mornings and quiet evenings. I had moved it out here after she passed, not because I wanted it out of the house, but because I wasn't ready to see it in the places where I was used to seeing her hold it. I picked it up the way you hold something that belonged to someone you loved carefully, like the weight of it means more than it should. And something was different. A slight thickness between certain pages, a firmness that hadn't registered before, or at least that I hadn't paid attention to before. I ran my thumb along the edge of the pages and almost opened it. Almost. But the light outside was fading fast, and I told myself I'd look at it later. I set it back on the shelf and returned to the oak plank. Later. I was always telling myself later. My cell phone rang at 6:15. The number belonged to Patty Greer, who owned Patty's Roadhouse out on Route 40, a bar and grill that had been a fixture of this county since before I could drive. Patty had known Elaine since they were both young women, arguing over hymn selections in the church choir. She was one of the few people who still called me without making me feel like I needed to explain myself. I picked up. "George." Her voice carried the unhurried warmth of a woman who had talked people through hard times her whole life. "Sorry to bother you on a Friday, but I've got something here at the restaurant. A man came in today, said he knew Elaine said he didn't have your address, left something for you, said it was important. I stood, very still, in the middle of my workshop. A man who knew Elaine. Something left in her name. "I'll come by," I said. "No rush," Patty said. "I'll be here." I hung up and stood there, in the dimming light, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of cut oak, looking at the kitchen window, where the light still burned, and the chair sat empty. Something moved in my chest, not quite grief. Something older and quieter. Something that felt, in a way, I couldn't yet name, like being called back to a world I had been slowly backing away from. I hadn't driven after dark since the evening of Elaine's funeral. The roads we used to travel together didn't feel like the same roads anymore. But I reached for my jacket. I picked up my keys. I locked the workshop door and walked out into the October dark for the first time in 5 months. I didn't know what was waiting down that road. I only knew that Elaine had sent something, and that whatever it was, she had meant for me to find it tonight. The drive out to Route 40 took 11 minutes. I know because I counted not the miles, but the minutes, the way a man counts things, when his mind needs something small and manageable to hold on to. The October dark pressed flat against the windshield. The headlights carved a narrow corridor through it, and on either side, the bare cornfields stretched away into nothing. I had driven this road 100 times. It felt different without someone in the passenger seat telling me I was taking the curves too fast. Patty's Roadhouse announced itself, the way it always had, a red neon sign above the door that buzzed faintly in the cold, the parking lot half filled with pickup trucks and work vehicles belonging to people who had earned their Friday night. The building itself was low and wide, cedar-sided, with a covered porch that leaned slightly to the left and had been leaning that way for as long as anyone could remember. It was the kind of place that didn't need to try hard because it had already decided what it was decades ago and stuck with it. I pushed through the front door, and the warmth hit me first. That particular blend of wood smoke, fryer oil, and coffee that had been soaking into the walls of this building since before I was middle-aged. A Merle Haggard song drifted out of the old jukebox in the corner, low and unhurried, the kind of music that doesn't ask anything of you except to sit down and let it wash over you. A handful of locals occupied the bar stools and booths, none of them paying much attention to anything beyond their own conversations and their own plates. Patty Greer was behind the counter. She was a solidly built woman in her mid-60s. With silver hair, she kept pulled back, and the kind of face that had logged enough miles to know which expressions were worth wearing. She had run this place for 30 years and knew every regular by their order before they opened their mouths. When she saw me come through the door, something in her face shifted, not surprise exactly, something closer to relief. She didn't make a fuss. She just nodded toward the booth second from the window on the left side, the one Elaine and I had always taken when we came here together, and said, "Sit down, George. I'll get your coffee." I sat, and out of a habit I hadn't managed to break in 5 months, I didn't take the seat facing the wall. I took the one facing the room, the way Elaine always insisted. She used to say I was restless if I couldn't see the door, which was true, and which I had never once admitted. Patty came by a minute later with the coffee pot in one hand and 2 mugs in the other. She set one in front of me, black no sugar, and placed the second one across the table, without a word, with exactly 1 teaspoon of sugar already stirred in. Then she straightened up, refilled a neighboring table, and moved on down the counter as if nothing had happened. I looked at the second mug. The steam rose from it in a slow, thin curl. I looked away. That was when I noticed him, in the far corner of the room, tucked into the shadow, where the overhead light didn't quite reach. A young man sat alone. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark canvas work jacket, with the collar turned up against a cold he'd carried in from outside. His hair was cut short and neat, the kind of cut that doesn't happen at a regular barber shop. He had a plate of food in front of him he hadn't touched, and a coffee mug he was ignoring, and his eyes were on the front door with the particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with curiosity. He wasn't waiting for a friend. He was watching for something specific. At his feet lay a dog, large, maybe 80 pounds, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light around it. The animal's ears stood straight up, and it lay with its chin just above the floor, eyes moving slowly across the room in a slow, steady pattern. Not sleeping, not restless, working. I leaned toward Patty the next time she passed. "The man in the back corner," I said, keeping my voice low. "You know him?" She glanced over her shoulder in the practiced way of someone who had already looked many times. "Been coming in 3 nights a week for the past 2 months," she said. "Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Always that same booth. Orders coffee, shares whatever he eats with the dog. Watches the door." She paused. "Never causes trouble. Tips well. Beyond that," she gave a small shrug that said the rest wasn't hers to offer, and moved on. 3 nights a week for 2 months. That was deliberate. Men like that young quiet, positioned with their backs to the wall and their eyes on the entrance, didn't keep that kind of schedule by accident. I was still turning that over when I became aware that the dog was no longer watching the room. It was watching me, not glancing in my direction, not tracking movement, watching me the way certain animals do when they've already worked something out and are simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Its amber eyes were fixed on my face with a steadiness that made me feel oddly like I had been recognized before I had introduced myself. I held its gaze for a moment, then I looked back at my coffee. Outside, through the plate glass window, I caught sight of something that hadn't been there when I pulled in a dark-colored SUV, parked at the far end of the lot away from the other vehicles. Its engine was running. I could see the faint tremor of exhaust rising in the cold air above the hood. The headlights were off. The doors were shut. Nobody had gotten out. A vehicle that parks away from the lights and leaves the engine running is not a vehicle whose driver plans to come inside. I was still watching it when I heard the scrape of a chair across the floor. I looked back toward the corner booth. The young man had stood up. The dog rose at the exact same moment. No command, no signal I could see, just a perfect simultaneity that comes from a partnership built over years of hard use. They crossed the room together, not toward the door, toward me, moving with the kind of unhurried certainty that doesn't leave much room for other interpretations. He stopped at the edge of my table. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table between us, palms upward, fingers open and still. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a statement. Whatever I was about to hear, he wanted me to see his hands first. "Sir," he said. His voice was low and even, each word given its full weight. "In about 4 minutes, someone is going to walk through that door who wants to take everything you have left." He held my eyes without wavering. "I need you to sit still. I need you to trust me. 73 years on this earth teaches you a few things about the difference between a man who is telling you the truth and a man who wants you to believe he is." I sat with those 2 sentences and turned them over the way you turn a stone in your hand, slowly looking at every surface before you decide what you're holding. The young man across from me hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't leaned in close or grabbed my arm or done any of the things that people do when they're trying to manufacture urgency. He had simply placed his words on the table between us, the same way he had placed his hands, and left them there, for me to do with what I would. That steadiness was what kept me in my seat. I looked at him the way I hadn't allowed myself to look before, when he was still a stranger across a dark room. Up close, the details filled in differently. The jaw carried a few days of growth that didn't suggest carelessness so much as a man whose mind had been occupied with other things. The short, precise haircut had grown out just enough at the edges to suggest it had been a while since anyone had told him how to wear it. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that didn't come from laughing. And then I saw his left wrist. His hands were still resting palm up on the table. And on the inside of his left wrist, there was a scar, pale thin, running perhaps 2 inches along the skin. Not the kind that comes from a kitchen accident or a childhood fall. It had the particular settled quality of something old enough to have made its peace with the skin around it, but visible enough that it hadn't been forgotten. I had seen marks like that before, on men who had come back from places that left them changed in ways they didn't always talk about. I didn't ask about it. Some things a man earns the right not to explain. What I noticed next was the way he was sitting. His back was flat against the booth, not resting against it. There is a difference, and it's the kind of difference that takes years of a certain kind of living to produce. His weight was balanced. His shoulders were level. He was occupying the space with the particular economy of someone who had learned in environments. I could only imagine that stillness used correctly is its own form of readiness. He was not tense. He was prepared. And then something warm and solid pressed against my left leg. I looked down. The dog, Dusk, I would learn, had moved from beside his handler without any visible signal, and was now sitting with the broad top of his head resting against my thigh. Not pushing, not demanding anything, just present the way certain animals are present when they've decided you're worth staying close to. His ears remained upright, still tracking the room, but the weight of his head against my leg was deliberate and calm. Something about it steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. "What's his name?" I asked. I don't know why that was the question that came out first. Maybe because it was the only one I could answer without needing to understand everything else. "Dusk," the young man said. I put my hand on the dog's head. He didn't move. Neither did I. I thought about Elaine, then, the way she had a saying she came back to so often over the years that it had worn itself smooth in my memory like a river stone you've carried in your pocket long enough that you forget it's there until your hand finds it again. She said it about neighbors and hired hands and strangers who showed up at the farm gate needing something. Trust the ones who come with open hands, George. She said it the way people say things they believe down to the bone, not as advice, but as instruction, as if she had worked it out through long experience and was simply passing along what the evidence had taught her. This young man had walked to my table, sat down across from me, and put his hands where I could see them. He hadn't offered me anything, hadn't asked me for anything. He had simply told me what was coming and asked me to hold still. I glanced at my watch. 3 minutes had passed. Outside the window, the dark-colored SUV was still there. I didn't look long. One brief glance was enough to confirm. The exhaust still rose above the hood in the cold air. Whatever was parked out there was still waiting on whatever was supposed to happen next. The Merle Haggard song on the jukebox had run its course and given way to something quieter, something with a steel guitar that cried softly under the low murmur of the room. The trucker 2 stools down had stopped reading his phone. The couple near the far wall had gone still, in the particular way people go still when the atmosphere of a room shifts, and they're not sure why yet, but their bodies have registered it. Rooms know things before people do. I looked back at the young man. He was watching the door, not with anxiety, with the focused, patient attention of someone who had already decided what his response would be and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. "Whatever is about to happen," I said, keeping my voice low, "you already know about it." He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. 1 minute left by my count. I thought about the drive out here, about the kitchen light burning in an empty house, about a Bible on a workshop shelf that sat a little heavier than it should, about a woman who had never done a single thing in her life without a reason for it. I thought about open hands. The bell above the front door rang. It didn't have the casual sound of a customer coming in from the cold, the kind of ring that dissolves into the background noise of a Friday night. This one landed differently sharp and deliberate, the way sound lands when what follows it has already made up its mind. The door swung open, and with it came a rush of cold October air and the measured sound of more than one set of footsteps crossing the threshold together, moving with the quiet coordination of people who had already decided what they were going to do when they got inside. There are moments when the heart and the mind arrive at the same information by completely different roads. My mind registered her first, the silhouette in the doorway, the squared shoulders, the posture of someone who had already decided how this evening was going to go. My heart followed half a second behind, reaching back through 46 years of memory, trying to find the version of her that matched what I was feeling. It was my daughter, Valerie. She was 46 years old and looked it in the way that driven women sometimes do, not worn down by time, but shaped by it, hardened at the edges in places that used to be soft. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, tailored trousers, and shoes that had no business on a gravel parking lot in Tennessee. Her dark hair was pulled back without a strand out of place, despite the October wind she had just walked through. In Nashville, where she ran the operations of a commercial real estate firm, she would have looked exactly right. Here, under Patty's low yellow light, she looked like someone sent from a different world to conduct business in this one. She found me in under 2 seconds. She was always good at locating what she was looking for. I used to think that was a gift. She smiled. It started at her mouth and traveled upward with practiced ease, the kind of smile built for boardrooms where the right expression is a professional tool. It stopped just short of her eyes. Behind them was a distance the smile couldn't reach, and in that distance, I saw something I recognized but hadn't wanted to name. She had not come here to check on me. Behind her came a heavy-set man in a dark jacket that sat slightly wrong across the left side, the fabric pulling in a way that had nothing to do with the cut. He didn't look at me. He looked at the room's corners, the counter, the kitchen door, the practiced scan of someone paid to assess a space rather than be comfortable in it. 2 younger men in dark suits followed, positioning themselves near the entrance and the far end of the counter with the quiet efficiency of people who had been briefed on where to stand. Last through the door came a slight man in a gray wool overcoat, carrying a leather document case under one arm. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to walking into difficult rooms. He was still in the shadow of the entryway. I couldn't see his face yet. Valerie crossed toward my booth. She gave the young man sitting across from me one brief glance, the kind you give unexpected furniture, then focused entirely on me. "Dad." Her voice carried warmth, the way a performance carries warmth, technically correct, hitting all the right notes. "I've been so worried about you. I'm glad you came out tonight." I had heard versions of that sentence for months, always wrapped carefully enough that nothing in the individual words gave you anything to reasonably push back against. What you pushed back against was the assumption living underneath them, quiet, patient, and steadily rearranging things. "I'm having coffee, Valerie," I said. "It's late, Dad," gently, with the patience of someone who has decided the other person is being unreasonable. "You shouldn't be out on your own. Let's go home." Elaine had said something about Valerie years ago that I had filed away in the drawer, where you keep things that feel uncomfortable but true. We'd been sitting on the back porch after one of Valerie's visits, watching her taillights disappear down the drive, and Elaine had looked out at the cornfield a long moment before she spoke. "She has your stubbornness, George," she had said, "but she never learned what to do with it." I hadn't asked what she meant. I understood it now. The man in the gray overcoat stepped forward and set his document case on the edge of the table. He withdrew a manila folder and placed it in front of me with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected a particular sequence of events to follow. The cover sheet read, "Psychological Capacity Assessment. Patient, George Raymond Calloway. Date of evaluation, October 25th, 2024. Below the header was the checklist, several items. The third one down read, "Patient demonstrates signs of diminished capacity to manage personal and financial affairs independently." The box beside it was already checked. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at my printed name above the signature line. I looked at the pre-checked box. Then I looked at Valerie, who was watching me with the expression of someone waiting for a specific reaction and prepared to manage whatever came. This was not a wellness visit. This was not a daughter worried about her father. This was a process set in motion long before tonight, before this parking lot, before anyone called me about a package left by a stranger. Whatever this was, it had been planned carefully. And for some time, the man in the gray overcoat stepped into the full light of the overhead lamp to retrieve a second document. And in that light, for the first time, I saw his face clearly. I knew that face, not from a waiting room or a chance meeting. I knew it from the chair beside a bed in the back room of my own house, from long afternoons, when the light came through the curtains at a low angle, and Elaine spoke quietly about things she couldn't keep entirely to herself anymore. He had sat with her through the hardest weeks. He had been the one she trusted with the parts of herself that were most difficult to carry. Her doctor, standing in Patty's Roadhouse, holding a folder with my name on it and a box already checked. I said, his name, the way you say something you've been carrying without knowing it. Not as a question, not as a greeting, just as a fact that had finally found its way out into the open air. Webb. One word, flat and unornamented. And the room did something rooms rarely do. It went genuinely still. Not the background quiet of a Friday night settling into itself, but the particular stillness that falls when something has been said that everyone present understands cannot be unsaid. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of my table with his document case open and his hands resting against the folder, and he did not move. His eyes behind those thin-framed glasses met mine for exactly 1 second before they shifted to a point somewhere slightly left of my shoulder. It was the look of a man who had been hoping to conduct this evening as a transaction and had just discovered it was going to be something else entirely. I had heard his name for the first time about 14 months ago when Elaine came home from an appointment with something different in her expression. Not relief, not worry, but a kind of settled quality, like a window that had been stuck for years and finally opened. He really listens, George. She had told me that evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of chamomile tea. Most doctors hear what you say and file it. Marcus actually listens. I had been glad for her. I had thought it was a gift, that quality, a physician who paid genuine attention to the person in front of him, who retained what he was told and used it to understand rather than simply to diagnose. Over the following months, she spoke of him occasionally, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found a professional she trusted completely. I understood now what that listening had been for. Every word she had offered in those appointments, her fears, her hopes, the particular texture of her worry about what would happen after she was gone, had been received and stored by a man who was standing in a roadside bar with a pre-marked folder and a financial arrangement with my daughter. "This is a standard medical procedure, Dad," Valerie said, moving to fill the silence with the smooth efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment. "Dr. Webb is simply here to complete a preliminary evaluation. It's routine. It doesn't commit you to anything." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Webb. His hands, which had been resting beside the open folder, had gone still in a way that was different from stillness. It was the stillness of a man holding himself in place against the pull of an instinct to retreat. A man whose conscience, whatever remained of it, was conducting its own quiet accounting. "How much," I said, keeping my voice level, "did she offer you?" Not an accusation, just a coordinate, a fixed point on a map I was only now beginning to read correctly. Webb's mouth opened slightly. Then it closed. His hands remained where they were. He said nothing, and that silence, in its own way, told me everything the folder could not. The friend I had known through Elaine's stories would have pushed back. He would have been offended, or at least performed offense. He would have said something sharp in the way of a man whose integrity had been questioned. Instead, he stood in the wreckage of whatever he had agreed to, and simply declined to confirm what we both already understood. Valerie stepped forward. "This isn't about money, Dad. This is about making sure you're properly cared for. You've been alone for 5 months. The property alone requires management. You shouldn't have to." "Dr. Webb," I said his name again quietly. He flinched, small controlled, but there. Across the table, the young man who had told me to sit still and trust him leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped to a register meant only for me, carrying beneath the surface noise of the room like something moving underwater. 2.3 million, he said. Quiet, unhurried. That's what she owes. A real estate development deal out of Nashville. The deadline is 45 days from tonight. I sat with that number for a moment. $2.3 million. I turned it over in my mind, the way you turn something over when you're trying to understand not just what it is, but what it explains. It explained the timeline. It explained the precision of the plan, the folder, the pre-checked box, the physician, the men in dark suits positioned around the room. It explained the urgency underneath Valerie's practiced patience. She wasn't doing this because she had decided I couldn't manage my own affairs. She was doing this because she had run out of other options, and a clock was running. I looked at my daughter. I had been looking at her evening through the filter of 46 years, searching for the child I knew. Inside the woman standing across from me, the way you search for a familiar landmark in a landscape that has changed. I stopped searching now and looked at what was actually there. The composure was intact. The posture was correct. But around the eyes, in the slight tension at the corners of her mouth, in the way her weight had shifted incrementally forward, when the young man spoke that number, there it was. Not the controlled authority of a woman executing a plan. The barely contained desperation of a person who has already spent everything she had and is now reaching for what belongs to someone else. She had my stubbornness. Elaine had been right about that. She had never learned what to do with it. $2.3 million is not a small problem, Valerie, I said. Something crossed her face, then fast involuntary, the kind of reaction the body produces before the mind can intercept it. Her jaw tightened. The composure held, but only just, and the effort of holding it was visible now in a way it hadn't been 60 seconds ago. She glanced at Webb, then back at me, recalculating. I don't know where you heard that, she said carefully, but this conversation is about your well-being and not. At my feet, something shifted. I felt it before I saw it, a change in the weight and warmth against my leg, as Dusk adjusted his position. I looked down. The dog had turned his head toward the far side of the room, toward the heavy-set man in the dark jacket who had come in with Valerie and stationed himself near the counter. Dusk's head was tilted at a slight angle. His nose had lifted almost imperceptibly, drawing in something from across the room that the rest of us couldn't detect. His ears, which had been tracking the room in their usual slow rotation, had gone fixed, pointed, locked. He hadn't made a sound. He didn't need to. Whatever he had found in the air, coming off that man, he had found it precisely and completely, and he was not going to look away. The young man across from me stood up. He didn't push back from the table. He didn't make a production of it. He simply unfolded himself from the booth with the quiet economy of someone who has done difficult things before and understands that speed is not always the same as readiness. One moment he was seated. The next, he was standing his full height considerable, his weight distributed, with the balanced stillness of a man whose body had been trained to be useful in exactly these kinds of moments. He looked at Valerie's man near the counter, not with aggression, not with warning, with the particular directness of someone stating a fact. "Ask your man to step back," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, carrying just far enough to reach the right ears. Dusk doesn't like what he's carrying. The room held its breath. The heavy-set man near the counter, the one who had come in with Valerie and spent the evening watching the room, rather than being part of it, did something then that I don't think he intended to do. He took half a step backward. It was small, involuntary, the kind of physical response that happens below the level of decision, when the body reacts to being seen before the mind can instruct it to stand still. He caught himself almost immediately, but the half step had already happened, and everyone at the table had seen it, including Valerie. Something moved behind her eyes, fast, recalibrating, and then her expression resettled into its practiced composure. But it wasn't quite the same as before. There was a hairline fracture in it now that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. I looked at the man she'd brought with her, really looked the way I should have looked when he first positioned himself near the counter with his jacket hanging wrong on the left side. I had grown up around working people, farmers, loggers, men who carried tools and equipment as a matter of daily life, and I knew what uneven weight looked like on a body trying not to show it. The fabric on his left side pulled differently than it should, sat lower. The kind of asymmetry that doesn't come from a wallet or a set of keys. Whatever he was carrying under that jacket, it was not something you brought to a routine medical visit. At my feet, dusk rose, not with the sudden energy of alarm, but with the slow, deliberate purpose of an animal that has completed its assessment and arrived at a conclusion. He came to his full height beside the young man and along the ridge of his spine, from his shoulders to the base of his tail, the fur lifted in a single, precise line. He made no sound. He didn't need to. His entire body had become a statement, directed, unambiguous, and absolutely certain of what it had detected. Valerie looked at this dog. Something in her jaw tightened. Then she looked at me, and I watched her make a decision. I had seen her make decisions before in business, in arguments, in the particular negotiations that happen inside families over years of accumulated tension. She had, a small one, a slight shift of weight onto her right foot before she changed direction. She did it now. Mom would have wanted this, Dad. She said it quietly, carefully. The way you place something fragile on a surface you're not sure will hold it. 5 words. And in those 5 words, she reached past everything else in the room. Past the folder. Past the man with the asymmetric jacket. Past the dog with his raised spine. And went straight for the one place where she knew I had no armor left. Beneath the table, something pressed against my foot. Once. Deliberate. I looked across at the young man. He was watching me with the steady attention of someone who had anticipated this exact moment. Don't, he said. One word, spoken at a volume only the two of us could catch. Not a command, an anchor. The kind of word you say to someone who is standing at the edge of something they can't come back from, asking them to take one more breath before they decide. I sat with it. I put both hands flat on the table and sat with it. Behind the counter, I caught a glimpse of Patty. She had set down the coffee pot she'd been using as a reason to stay near our end of the room, and her phone was in her hand screen, angled away from the dining area, her thumb moving across it in short, deliberate strokes. Then the phone disappeared into her apron pocket, and she picked up a dish towel, and her face returned to the expression of a woman simply doing her job on a Friday night. Whatever she was telling someone, she was telling them quickly. Valerie hadn't finished. That was the thing about her. She had our family's particular version of tenacity, the kind that doesn't recognize when a door has closed and keeps pushing at it anyway. She took half a step closer to the table, and her voice dropped into something that was meant to sound intimate, but landed as pressure. She talked to me about you, Dad, in the last weeks. She said she was afraid of what would happen when she was gone. She said she didn't know how you were going to manage out here alone. A pause, precisely placed. She asked me to take care of you. Those were her words. Each sentence landed in a specific location, not in the reasoning part of my mind, where I might have examined them for accuracy and found them wanting, in the place where I kept everything that still had her name attached to it. I have lived long enough to know the difference between grief and a wound. Grief is the ocean, deep and wide, and something you learn slowly and badly to navigate. A wound is local, specific. It is the exact point where something sharp entered. What Valerie was doing now was pressing on a wound and calling it comfort. The anger that moved through me then was not hot. It was not the quick flare of a man losing his temper in a moment of frustration. It was something older and colder and more structural than that, the slow, irresistible rise of a river that has been held back long enough and has finally found the low point in the wall. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my face still. But underneath both of those things, the water was rising. The anger was still there. But anger is not always the thing that needs to move first. I looked at the young man's hands, still palm up on the table, still open, unchanged through everything Valerie had said and done since she walked through that door. And in the back of my memory, worn smooth from years of quiet repetition, something Elaine had told me settled into place with a clarity I hadn't been ready for until this exact moment. She had been right. She was almost always right. My hand moved not toward the folder, Not toward the pen sitting beside it, but toward my chest, toward the left breast pocket of my jacket, where I had carried Elaine's Bible every day for 5 months, the way a man carries something he cannot explain and doesn't try to. I drew it out slowly. The leather was warm from being close to my body all evening. Dark brown, the spine worn pale at the edges, from decades of her thumbs working along it. As it cleared my pocket, something reached me, faint, the ghost of a scent, rather than the thing itself, lavender. And something underneath it, dry and specific to her, in a way I had never managed to put into words. It lasted 2 seconds. Then it was gone. But 2 seconds was enough. I set the Bible on the table. It settled with a weight that was slightly more than it should have been. I had noticed that wrongness twice before. Once in the workshop the evening she passed, and again tonight, on the shelf before Patty called. Both times I had told myself later. Later had arrived. I opened it to the Psalms, where her hands had rested most often, where the pages had the particular softness that comes from years of the same fingers turning them. And there, tucked between 2 pages, held flat by the gentle pressure of the closed cover, was a white envelope, thick, slightly aged at the edges. And on the front, in the handwriting, I would know anywhere, 6 words written in the cursive she had carried since girlhood. For George, when the time comes. I did not open it. I held it in both hands and looked at those 6 words, the way you look at something you've been given that you're not yet ready to receive. I then looked at the way she formed the letter G, with a slight upward flick at the close of the curve, a small flourish she never abandoned. I looked at the period after comes, placed with the same precision she brought to everything. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, quietly, thoroughly, and well before anyone else would have thought to start. The quality of the air in the room shifted. I looked up. Valerie was staring at the envelope. The composure that had carried her through the entire evening, through the folder, the doctor, the number the young man had named, was simply gone. Not cracked, gone. What remained in her face was something I hadn't seen there before tonight. The look of a person who has just realized the ground beneath them was never what they believed it to be. She knew that handwriting too. Her hand came up from her side, fingers slightly extended, the unconscious movement of someone whose body is making a decision before the mind has finished weighing in. "Dad!" Her voice had shed its performance. What was underneath was rawer and less controlled. "Let me hold that. We can look at it together somewhere private." She took a step toward the table. She didn't complete it. Dusk rose to his full height and turned to face her directly. He made no sound. He didn't need to. Every line of his body was composed and certain, and communicating something that required no translation whatsoever. This did not need to become anything more than it already was. But whether it did was entirely up to the person standing in front of him. Valerie stopped. I looked at my daughter, then at the envelope. Then I said the only thing left to say, in the voice I used when I meant something completely, and without room for reinterpretation. "Sit down, Valerie." Not loud, not trembling, the voice of a man who had found solid ground again, after a long time of not knowing where it was and intended to stand on it. She sat down, but sitting down was not the same as standing down. And I had known Valerie long enough to understand the difference. She had retreated from one position the way a chess player retreats a piece, not out of surrender, but to open a different line. She folded her hands on the table, reset her expression into something softer and more personal than what she'd been wearing a moment ago. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed registers entirely. "I was with her, Dad, in those last weeks. You know that." I did know that. Valerie had driven down from Nashville 4 times in the final 2 months. She had sat in the kitchen, made phone calls, handled logistics, the way she handled most things, efficiently, and with the appearance of care. I had been grateful for it. I had told myself her presence meant what I needed it to mean. "She talked to me," Valerie continued. "Really talked. The way she couldn't always do when you were in the room, because she didn't want to worry you." A careful pause. "She was afraid, Dad, about what would happen after, about whether you'd be able to manage everything on your own. Each sentence was placed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this, who had identified the exact coordinates of maximum effect and was hitting them one by one. Not the words of a daughter sharing a grief, the words of someone using a grief they had observed closely enough to weaponize. There is a particular kind of violation that doesn't have a clean name. It isn't betrayal exactly, though it contains betrayal. It isn't cruelty exactly, though it requires a specific kind of willingness to cause pain. It is the experience of watching something sacred, something that belongs to love, and not to argument, being picked up and used as leverage. And the feeling it produces is not sadness. Sadness is wide and deep and something you can eventually learn to swim in. This was something with edges. I kept both hands flat on the table and let her talk. And while she talked, I went somewhere else, briefly. Back to the last real conversation Elaine and I had at the kitchen table. Not the final hours which belonged to a silence I have never tried to put into words, but the last evening when she was still fully herself, sitting across from me with both hands around a mug of chamomile tea. She wasn't drinking, looking at me in the particular way she had when she was deciding how much to say. She had reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "If anything happens," she said, "remember what I've always told you about the ones who ask for nothing." I had started to say something, some version of, "Don't talk like that," some reflexive resistance to the direction the conversation was heading. She had tightened her hand on mine just slightly, and I had stopped. "You'll know them," she said. "You'll know them when you need to." I came back to the present and looked across the meal. The young man's hands were still where they had been all evening. I didn't look at them long. I didn't need to. 3 words moved through my mind, quiet and certain, and I let them be enough. Valerie had paused, waiting for a response that hadn't come. She shifted slightly, recalibrating, and then tried a different angle. "The property alone. Dad, 40 acres, the lumber operation, the equipment, it's too much for one person." She knew that. She said it to me directly. Her voice dropped into something that was meant to sound like intimacy, but carried the pressure of a closing door. "She asked me to step in. She said you'd resist at first. She said that was just how you were." That last sentence was the tell. Elaine had never described me that way, not to anyone, not in 40 years of marriage. She had too much respect for both of us to reduce either one of us to a predictable type. Whoever had scripted this particular line hadn't known her well enough to know what she wouldn't say. At the edge of the table, the man in the gray overcoat cleared his throat. "Webb." He had been standing quietly since I'd said his name, filling as little space as possible, as if proximity to the walls might make him less visible. Now he took a small step forward, smoothing the front of his overcoat, reaching for the professional register that had apparently sustained him through 30 years of medical practice. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "if we could simply proceed with the preliminary portion of the evaluation, I can explain the process in full. It's quite straightforward, and I want to assure you that—" "How much?" I said. He stopped. "How much did she offer you?" The question landed in the room, the way a stone lands in still water. The impact first, then the rings spreading outward in every direction. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. The question was its own kind of weight, and it was addressed to a man whose silence on the subject I already knew would be more informative than any answer he gave. Webb's mouth opened. A word began to form, and then didn't. His hands, which had been holding the second document with the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information, went slightly still. He looked at the folder. He looked at the table. He looked at a point somewhere between the two. He said nothing, and that nothing told me everything. The man I had heard about through Elaine's stories. The physician who truly listened, who paid attention, who earned the trust of a woman who did not give her trust casually. That man would not have been able to stand in this room, holding this folder, without finding some way to account for himself. The fact that he couldn't spoke to a distance traveled that no amount of silence could shorten. I looked away from him. There was nothing left there worth looking at. The room had settled into a quiet that felt different from any of the quiet that had come before it. Not the held breath of people waiting for something to happen, but something closer to exhaustion, the particular stillness that falls when a thing has been fully seen, and there's no longer any point in pretending otherwise. And then the bell above the front door rang for the third time that evening. It didn't carry the casual sound of someone coming in from the cold. It didn't have the sharp deliberateness of Valerie's entrance or the patient weight of the footsteps that had followed her. It was a single clean note, and the footsteps that came with it were unhurried and even belonging to someone who had arrived exactly when they intended to and saw no reason to announce that fact with anything other than the simple act of walking through the door. The man who walked through the door was not large, and he didn't need to be. Dale Cooper was 58 years old and had been the sheriff of Putnam County for 15 years. He was lean through the shoulders, silver at the temples, with a pressed tan uniform, and a face that had long since stopped performing anything it didn't mean. He moved the way experienced men move, in situations they've already thought through, without hurry, without hesitation, without announcing himself as anything other than what he was. His eyes swept the room once. They found me, found the folder on the table, found the men positioned near the counter and the door. Then they found the young man sitting across from me, and something passed between them, a slight inclination of Cooper's head, an equally slight acknowledgement in return. The exchange of two people whose silences carry content. I filed that away for later. Valerie stepped forward before he'd taken 3 strides into the room. Sheriff Cooper, her boardroom voice smooth and immediately authoritative. We're conducting a private medical evaluation. Everything here is fully within legal parameters, and I'd ask that you... Cooper walked past her without breaking stride, without looking at her, without giving any indication that he had heard her speak. He stopped at the edge of my booth and looked at me directly. George, he said. Dale, I said. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat with the ease of someone who had decided to be at home in this room, regardless of what it was doing around him. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his uniform jacket. Before I give you this, he said, I owe you an explanation. He set his hand flat on the table, the envelope beneath it not yet revealed. 4 months before Elaine passed, she drove herself to my office, came alone, sat across from my desk, and put a sealed envelope between us. She asked me to hold it. She said I'd know the right moment to deliver it. He paused. She was specific about what that moment would look like. I waited. She also told me something that's been sitting with me since. Cooper's voice dropped a register, not for privacy, but for weight. Valerie had access to a shared phone account, an old family plan that never got properly closed out. She'd been monitoring your incoming calls. That's how she knew Patty called you tonight. That's why she and her people were already in that parking lot 30 minutes before you pulled in. She knew you were coming before you started your engine. The air went out of the room. I didn't look at Valerie. I didn't need to. I could feel the quality of her stillness from across the table, the stillness of someone absorbing information they hadn't planned for running, calculations that were no longer adding up. She also said something else. Cooper looked at me steadily. She said to tell you that tonight would be the night she meant George. She said you'd understand what that means. He drew the envelope out and placed it on the table. It was cream-colored, rectangular, sealed with a disc of red wax, bearing a notary stamp. The kind of seal that means a document has been witnessed and recorded and exists in a form that cannot be casually undone. He set it down directly on top of the manila folder, covering the psychological assessment, the pre-checked boxes, the signature line that had been waiting for my name all evening. The folder disappeared beneath cream paper and red wax. My name was written on the front. The same handwriting as the envelope in the Psalms. The same careful cursive, the same small flourish on the letter G. She had written my name on 2 envelopes. She had placed one where only I would find it, and she had given the other to the one man in this county she trusted to deliver it at exactly the right moment without being moved by anything that happened in the meantime. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Valerie. She was staring at this envelope. Not at me, not at Cooper, not at the young man who had told me to sit still 2 hours ago and had not moved from that instruction since. At the envelope, at the red wax seal, at the name written on the front in her mother's hand. I watched the understanding arrive. It didn't come as shock is fast and bright and burns itself out quickly. This was slower, more complete. The particular realization of someone who has spent months constructing a careful architecture and has just discovered that another structure was already standing inside it. Built, first built better. Built by someone who had seen all of this coming before the first stone of Valerie's plan was ever laid. Elaine had known, not guessed, not feared, known with the same precision she brought to the garden layout in the household ledger in the 38 years of quiet, deliberate choices that had held our life together. She had known, and she had moved, and she had done it so quietly that none of us had seen her hand until it was already finished. In 20 years of coming to this place, I had never once seen Patty Greer step out from behind her counter during a busy hour without a coffee pot or a plate in her hand. She came out now with neither. She walked with the unhurried purpose of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and had just watched it arrive. Her phone was in her right-hand screen, facing up, and she stopped at the edge of the table between Cooper and me without asking permission from anyone in the room. "Sheriff," she said, "I think you need to hear something." She set the phone on the table and pressed play. The recording began with ambient noise, the low, mechanical hum of the refrigeration unit in the back kitchen, the distant sound of the fryer, cycling down the faint creak of the building, settling in the cold. Sounds I had been hearing all evening without registering them. Sounds that Valerie and Webb had apparently decided were loud enough to provide cover. They were wrong. Valerie's voice came through first. Clear, unhurried, stripped of every trace of the warmth she had performed for the past 2 hours. "The timeline is 45 days from tonight. That's the hard deadline. If we don't have the conservatorship filed and the assets under management review. By then, the Nashville creditors move to formal proceedings, and everything becomes public." A pause. Then Webb's voice, thinner, less certain, carrying the particular quality of a man who has agreed to something and is only now beginning to understand the full weight of what he signed on to. What if he contests it? He seemed sharp on the phone when I spoke with his GP. He's 73, and he's been grieving alone for 5 months. Valerie's voice didn't change pitch or pace. "We're not asking for a full incapacity ruling. Just enough documented concern to file for temporary conservatorship over the property assets. By the time any challenge works through the court, the sale will already be in escrow." Another pause. "The assessment form, the preliminary one." Webb again, more quietly now. "The box on Section 3 is already marked flat, efficient. You're confirming a preliminary clinical concern, not making a diagnosis. That's well within your professional discretion." The recording ran for another 20 seconds of ambient noise, then ended. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than anything the room had produced all evening. Not the held breath of people waiting for something to happen. The silence of something having already happened, complete and irreversible, settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water that has already reached the bottom. I had been listening to my daughter's voice. I want to be precise about what that experience was because I think it matters. It was not the voice of a woman who had made a terrible decision under pressure. It was not the voice of someone who had convinced herself she was acting in my interest. It was the voice of a person conducting a transaction, discussing timelines and filings and asset reviews with the same emotional temperature she might use to discuss a property inspection or a contract renewal. There was nothing in it that belonged to a daughter. There was nothing in it that had ever sat at my kitchen table, or learned to drive in my south field, or called me from a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. when her son was born. It was the voice of a stranger who happened to share my name. Across the room, Webb pushed back from where he had been standing and took 2 steps toward the door. He didn't announce the movement. He simply began making it the way a man does when he has decided that his best remaining option is to no longer be in the room where he is. Cooper raised one hand. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for anything at his belt. He simply raised his right hand to approximately shoulder height, palm outward, with the calm authority of a man who has stopped traffic in both directions on a 2-lane county road and knows from long experience that the gesture alone is sufficient. Webb stopped. Patty picked up her phone, slipped it back into her apron pocket, and returned to her position behind the counter with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has done what she came to do and has no interest in theater. Tennessee, I should note, is a one-party consent state. A recording made by a person who is themselves a party to a conversation or who is present in a space where the conversation occurs is admissible. Patty had been present. Patty had been a party to every conversation that happened within the walls of her establishment. And the refrigeration unit had not, as it turned out, been loud enough. I looked at Valerie. She was looking at Cooper, not at me, not at the envelope with the red wax seal, not at the phone that had just played her own voice back at her, at Cooper. And the expression on her face was one I had not seen there before tonight. Not the performance of concern, not the controlled authority of the boardroom, not even the raw desperation that had surfaced when she saw the envelope in my hands. This was simpler than any of those things. It was the face of a person who has played a hand they believed was unbeatable and has just watched it lose, not to a better play, but to a preparation that was already in place before they ever sat down at the table. The particular defeat of someone who had planned carefully and at length and had failed to account for the one variable that mattered most. Her mother had been in this room first, not tonight, months ago, in the conversations that left no visible trace until this moment. Elaine had been here before the plan existed, before the folder was assembled, before the man in the gray overcoat was contacted, or the dark suits were arranged, or the phone records were accessed. She had lost before she started. She just hadn't known it until now. Cooper broke the wax seal. He did it without ceremony, one clean motion with his thumb along the edge of the flap, the red disc splitting and curling away from the paper. The sound it made was small and dry and precise, and in the silence that had settled over Patty's Roadhouse, it was the only sound there was. He withdrew the contents carefully. 3 items. A document folded in thirds on paper, heavy enough to hold its creases cleanly. A small brass key, the kind that belongs to a specific lock in a specific institution and fits nothing else in the world. And a note card, handwritten with a bank name and branch address in Cookeville, and a safe deposit box number written beneath it in Elaine's hand. Cooper set the key and the note card on the table and unfolded the document. He read it to himself first. 2 full minutes of silence, while his eyes moved down the page with the careful attention of a man making sure he understands what he's holding before he speaks it aloud. Then he looked up, looked at me, and began to read. This is the last will and testament of Elaine Grace Calloway, née Whitfield, executed and notarized in Putnam County, state of Tennessee, on the 14th of March, 2024. He paused at the date, and I felt the number land somewhere in my chest. March, 2 months before she passed. She had been sitting across from me at the kitchen table in March, drinking chamomile tea and asking me about the spring planting schedule. She had also apparently been doing other things. Cooper continued, I, Elaine Grace Calloway, being of sound mind, do hereby clarify the legal status of the property and assets described herein. The 42 acres located on Whitfield Road, Putnam County, Tennessee, together with all mineral rights, timber rights, and structures thereon, were conveyed to me as separate property through the estate of my father, Robert James Whitfield, in 1989, prior to my marriage to George Raymond Calloway. This property has never been commingled with marital assets and remains, under Tennessee law, my separate estate. He turned the page. As the sole legal owner of said property and assets, I do hereby bequeath the entirety of the Whitfield land holdings, including all contents of Safe Deposit Box number 447 at First Community Bank of Cookeville, to the Sawyer Harlow Foundation, a registered nonprofit organization providing transitional housing and support services to unhoused veterans to be held in perpetuity for the furtherance of its mission. Cooper lowered the document. The name of the foundation sat in the room the way a stone sits in still water, after it has already sunk, present settled, changing the surface of everything around it. I looked at the young man across the table. He was looking at the document in Cooper's hands, with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between recognition and the particular weight of a person receiving something they were told was coming, but still weren't entirely prepared for. Valerie had not moved. She was standing where she had been standing when the recording ended, in the same posture with the same folded hands. But the posture meant something different now. It was no longer the composed stance of a woman managing a situation. It was the stillness of someone whose body has not yet received the message that the ground beneath it is gone. She had come here tonight for 42 acres of Tennessee land that her mother had inherited from her grandfather and held in her own name for 35 years. She had built a plan around those acres, a careful, methodical plan that accounted for doctors and legal filings and the particular vulnerabilities of a grieving man who hadn't slept well in 5 months. She had accounted for nearly everything. She had not accounted for the fact that the land was never hers to take. She knew. Valerie said it to no one. Not to me, not to Cooper, not to the room. To the air, the way you say something when the audience for it is no longer present to hear it. 2 words barely above a whisper, carrying the full weight of a realization, arriving too late to be useful. I looked at the small brass key on the table. I thought about Elaine, sitting alone at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the way I had found her once last winter, when I came downstairs for water and the light was on, and she had papers spread out in front of her. She had gathered them quickly when she heard me on the stairs. She said she couldn't sleep. She said she was settling some old paperwork, nothing important. I had gone back to bed. I understood now what paperwork she had been settling. I understood why she had gathered it quickly when she heard my footsteps. Not because she was hiding something from me in the way that implies deception, but because she was protecting something she had already decided how to handle. And she knew that if I saw it, I would ask questions, and the answers would worry me in ways she no longer had the energy to manage alongside everything else she was carrying. She had handled it, quietly, completely, in the hours when the house was still and no one was watching. The brass key caught the light from the overhead lamp, small, ordinary, the kind of object you could carry for years in a coat pocket without anyone knowing what it opened. Whatever was inside that safe deposit box in Cookville, Elaine had put it there herself. She had addressed the note card in her own hand. She had sealed it with her own seal and given it to the one man she trusted to deliver it at the right moment. She had thought of everything. Valerie turned. She turned slowly, the way a person turns when their body is moving, before their mind has finished deciding where to look. And she looked for the first time all evening with the full and undivided attention she had been withholding since she walked through the door at the young man sitting across from me. She looked at him the way you look at something you should have seen sooner and didn't. Her voice, when it came, had shed every professional layer it had ever worn. What remained was smaller than anything she had shown tonight, uncertain in a way that nothing else had made her uncertain. "Who are you?" The answer never came. Not because Sawyer didn't have one, because the man in the dark jacket near the counter decided in the 3 seconds between Valerie's question and whatever would have followed it that the conversation had gone far enough in a direction he hadn't been paid to allow. He moved, not toward the door, toward me. His left shoulder dropped slightly as his weight shifted, and his right hand began a movement toward the interior of his jacket. The same jacket whose left side had been hanging wrong all evening. The same asymmetry I had noticed and understood and said nothing about until Sawyer said it for me. The movement was practiced and economical and had a specific destination in mind. It didn't arrive there. Dusk covered the distance between them before the hand completed its motion. 80 pounds of trained muscle, an absolute certainty, moving not with the frantic energy of alarm, but with the focused precision of an animal that has been taught exactly what to do in exactly this situation, and is doing it without hesitation or excess. He hit the man's forearm with the full weight of his body behind him, driving the hand back and away from the jacket. And then he held, positioned immovable, his body between the man's arm and the rest of the room, his eyes fixed on the man's face, with an attention that foreclosed any consideration of trying again. The man made a sound sharp, involuntary, and went very still. Sawyer was already moving. He hadn't waited for dusk to finish. The moment the man's shoulder dropped, Sawyer was out of the booth, crossing the 3 feet between his chair and mine, with the same unhurried speed that suggests the body has rehearsed something so many times it no longer requires conscious instruction. He came around to my side of the table and stood between me and the room, not dramatically, not with his arms out or his chest forward, just standing there, solid and present, the way a wall stands. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the rest of the room, doing the same slow accounting that Dusk had been doing all evening. Cooper stood up. He reached to his side with his right hand and unholstered his service weapon. He didn't raise it. He didn't point it at anyone, or adopt a stance, or say anything that television would have required him to say. He simply held it at his side, the matte finish, catching the yellow light of the overhead lamp in a way that made it visible to everyone in the room, without requiring anyone to look directly at it. Visible was enough. The 2 men in dark suits near the entrance and the counter had gone very still. Webb had pressed himself against the wall beside the kitchen door. Valerie hadn't moved from where she was standing, but her hands, which had been folded at her waist all evening in the posture of controlled authority, had come apart and were hanging at her sides. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Not the front door, the back one, the service entrance, behind the kitchen pass-through that Patty used for deliveries, and that most of the people in this room hadn't known existed until this moment. 2 deputies in tan uniforms stepped through it, and they had not come unprepared. They positioned themselves at angles that covered the room, without overlap, professional and unhurried, the way people position themselves when they've had 20 minutes to think about where to stand. 20 minutes. About the time Patty had disappeared briefly into the back with her phone, before returning to look like a woman simply doing her job. The man in the dark jacket looked at Dusk, still holding his arm, with complete and unbroken focus. He looked at Sawyer standing between him and George. He looked at Cooper with the service weapon at his side. He looked at 2 deputies covering the room from the back. He conducted this assessment with the systematic attention of someone running a calculation. And when the calculation finished, the answer was plain. He raised his hands, slowly, palms outward, the universal language of a decision made. The 2 men in dark suits looked at each other. Then they looked at the deputies. Then they raised their hands as well, with the resigned efficiency of professionals who understand when a situation has resolved itself and have no personal investment in pretending otherwise. Webb raised his without being asked, which suggested that whatever remained of his professional judgment was still functioning well enough to read a room. Cooper crossed to this man in the dark jacket with the even stride of someone performing a routine function. He passed his service weapon to one of the deputies without looking and produced a pair of restraints from his belt. He worked without commentary, without drama, without the particular satisfaction that smaller men allow themselves to show in moments like this. The metallic sound of the restraints, clicking into place, was precise and final in the quiet of the room. Then the deputies moved to the 2 men in suits, and the sound came twice more, each one landing in the silence, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time finishing. "Good choice," Cooper said. He said it to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. He said it in the same tone he might use to note that the weather had cleared, or that the road was better than expected, the tone of a man for whom the current situation was always one of the available outcomes, and who had simply been waiting to see which one the room would choose. He picked up his service weapon from the deputy and holstered it. Then he looked at Valerie. Cooper said something to Valerie in a low voice that I couldn't hear from where I was sitting. Whatever it was, she nodded once, a single mechanical dip of the head, the kind that means compliance, rather than agreement, and began moving toward the door. One of the deputies fell into step beside her, not touching her arm, not directing her with any visible pressure, simply present in the way that makes a person understand that the direction of travel has been decided. She stopped at my table. The deputy paused with her patient and unhurried, and Valerie stood at the edge of the booth and looked at me, not with the performance she had worn all evening, not the warmth, not the authority, not the carefully managed concern, just looked, with the eyes of a person who has arrived at the far end of something and is only now beginning to understand the distance they have traveled to get here. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. I hadn't expected her to, and I think somewhere, beneath whatever she was feeling in that moment, she knew that neither of those things would have landed anywhere useful. I looked back at her. I have been a father for 46 years. I know what it is to carry a person inside your chest, not metaphorically, but as an actual weight, a presence that occupies space in you, long after they have grown beyond needing you to carry them. I had carried Valerie since the morning she was born, in a county hospital 12 miles from here, and I was carrying her still, and I understood that nothing that had happened tonight was going to change that particular fact. But I was also looking for something in her face that I couldn't find. I was looking for the 6-year-old who had fallen asleep against my shoulder on the drive home from the Putnam County Fair, her hair smelling of cotton candy, and her shoes still on, because she had been too tired to take them off, and I hadn't wanted to wake her. I was looking for the 12-year-old who had cried at the kitchen table when her best friend moved away, and who had let me sit beside her for 2 hours without saying anything, because sometimes sitting is the only thing that helps. I was looking for some version of the person I had raised in the house 3 miles down the road. I couldn't find her. I didn't know how long she had been gone. I didn't know, and I suspected I would be working on that question for a long time after tonight. Your mother loved you, Valerie, I said. I kept my voice level and my hands flat on the table. I looked at her directly. She just loved you enough to stop you. Valerie held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Not in shame, not in anger, but in the manner of someone who has heard something true and needs a moment before they can decide what to do with it. She moved toward the door, and the deputy moved with her, and I watched her walk out of Patty's Roadhouse and into the October dark without looking back. Webb was next. He came past my table, without slowing, without looking in my direction, with his document case held against his chest and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the front door. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. Smaller than the man who had walked in with a sealed folder and a pre-checked box and the borrowed authority of 30 years of medical practice. Whatever that authority had been worth, he had spent it tonight, and the spending showed. Patty watched him go from behind her counter. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has known for a long time that a particular bill was going to come due and has simply been waiting to see what form it arrived in. The men in dark suits were escorted out by the 2 deputies. The door swung shut behind the last of them, and for the first time since the bell above it had rung 3 times in the space of 2 hours, the room returned to something resembling itself. The jukebox had gone quiet at some point. During the evening, I hadn't noticed when. The fryer had cycled down. The refrigeration unit hummed its low, steady note behind the kitchen wall. The trucker who had been at the counter when I arrived was gone. The couple near the far window had left. Patty moved behind her counter with the quiet efficiency of a woman restoring order to her own house, straightening things that didn't need straightening, because the motion was familiar, and familiar things help. The silence that settled over the room was not the silence that had been there at the beginning of the evening. That silence had been heavy, with something pending the particular atmospheric pressure of a situation that has not yet declared itself. This was different. This was the silence of aftermath. Wide and still, and beneath the tiredness of it, something that felt unexpectedly close to clean. I sat with it for a moment. Then I looked at the young man across from me. He was still standing where he had positioned himself when the man in the dark jacket moved between my booth and the rest of the room. His weight balanced his hands at his sides. He had not returned to his seat. He was looking at the door through which the last of them had just been walked, with the expression of a man conducting a final check on a completed task, thorough professional, making sure nothing has been missed before standing down. Slowly, he turned and looked at me. I had carried a question since the moment he sat down across from me. I had carried it through everything that followed through the folder and the recording and the red wax seal and the name of a foundation I hadn't heard before tonight. I had carried it the way you carry something you know you'll eventually set down, waiting for the right surface. Now, I said, I think you owe me an answer to a question I've been sitting on all night. Sawyer looked at me for a moment. Then he came back to the table and sat down, not with the measured soldier's economy that had characterized every movement he'd made since he first walked toward my booth hours ago, but with the simpler, quieter weight of a person who has finished the thing they came to do and is ready at last to be only themselves. He looked at the table for a long moment, not avoiding my eyes, processing something, finding the right place to begin the way you find the right place to set down something heavy, choosing the surface carefully before you let go of the weight. Then he looked up. My name is Sawyer Harlow, he said. My mother's name, before she married, was Elaine Grace Whitfield. I did not move. I want to be precise about what happened in the seconds that followed, because I think the sequence matters. My mind received the words. It parsed them individually, each one clear, each one in its correct grammatical place, and then it attempted to assemble them into meaning, and the assembling took longer than it should have. Not because the words were complicated, because the thing they were describing was too large for the space I had available for it. Elaine Grace Whitfield, the name she had carried for 22 years before she became Elaine Grace Calloway, the name on the deed to the Whitfield land, the name on the document Cooper had read aloud 40 minutes ago, the name on the foundation. I sat with my hands flat on the table and looked at the young man across from me and did not say anything, because there was nothing in my immediate inventory of words that felt proportionate to what I had just been told. Sawyer didn't rush to fill the silence. He understood, I think, that I needed it. She found me 4 years ago, he said. I was in Nashville. I had been out of the service for 2 years, and I wasn't doing well. He said it plainly, without the particular performance that people sometimes use when they're describing difficult periods, neither minimizing it nor leaning into it for effect. Just the fact of it stated clean. I was staying at a transitional shelter on the east side. I'd been there about 3 months. He paused, looking at something that wasn't in the room. She came to the front door one morning, asked for me by name. I didn't know who she was. I'd never seen a photograph, never been given a name. She was just a part of my history that had always been a blank. He looked back at me. She stood there with her hands folded in front of her, and she said, I think I owe you a conversation, if you'll let me. Those were her first words to me. I thought about Elaine, driving to Nashville alone, finding the shelter, walking up to the front door. I thought about what it had cost her to do that, not in money, but in the particular currency of a person who takes responsibility seriously and had been carrying something for a long time. We wrote letters, Sawyer continued, for 4 years. She came to Nashville twice. I came here once, but I stayed in town. I didn't come to the farm. She wanted to keep things separate. She said, he stopped briefly, choosing the words. She said what you two had built together was its own thing, and she didn't want to complicate it. She said you didn't need to carry her past on top of everything else you were already carrying together. The letters. 4 years of letters written at the kitchen table while I slept upstairs. Filed somewhere I hadn't known to look. Between two people finding their way toward each other, across a distance that wasn't only geographic. She told me about you, Sawyer said. In almost every letter. The farm, the lumber operation, the way you worked. A pause. She said you were the best man she had ever known. She said you deserved to live out your days in peace on the land you'd given your life to. I looked at him. I had been looking at him all evening, but I had been looking through the lens of a stranger. cataloging his stillness, his discipline, the scar on his wrist, the way he moved through a difficult room. I looked at him now, without that lens, with nothing between my eyes and what was actually there, and I saw what I should have seen earlier if I had known to look for it. His eyes were green, not the flat, unremarkable green that the word sometimes suggests. A particular green, deep and varied, with a quality that changed slightly, depending on the angle of the light, the way a field changes when clouds move across it. The green of the Tennessee bottomland, after 3 days of spring rain, when the color is so saturated it seems to generate its own light. I had loved that color for 38 years. I had looked across a kitchen table at it every morning. I had watched it soften in the evenings when she was tired and sharpen in the mornings when something interested her. I had seen it last in a bedroom window in May, with the curtains open and the cornfield smell coming through, going still, and then gone. It was looking at me now from a face I had met 3 hours ago in a roadside bar on Route 40, and the recognition of it arrived not as a thought, but as something older, a response from a part of me that doesn't wait for the mind to finish deciding what it's feeling. She had sent me someone with her eyes, whether she had intended that as comfort or simply as the natural consequence of a truth she could no longer keep entirely separate from the rest of her life. I didn't know. I suspected I would think about that question for a long time. I suspected there wasn't a clean answer, and that Elaine, who had understood complexity better than anyone I had ever known, had accepted that before she ever picked up a pen to write the first letter. Sawyer watched me absorb this. He didn't look away. He sat with the patience of someone who has delivered a difficult thing and understands that the other person's process of receiving it deserves its full time. When the silence had run its natural course, he asked me something. "How much did you actually know tonight, sir?" I looked at him across the table, at the green eyes, at the hands resting open on the worn formica between us, the same hands that had been there since he first sat down unchanged through everything. I said nothing. The silence ran its course. Then I smiled, not the kind of smile that belongs to happiness or relief, or the clean resolution of a thing that has been difficult. Something quieter than any of those, the smile of a man who has just located something he had put down so long ago he had stopped believing he would find it again. It arrived without my deciding to produce it, which is how you know when a smile is real. Sawyer watched it happen. His expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but the particular attention of someone recalibrating. "She called me," I said, "the morning she gave you the letter." He went very still. "She called early before 7. I was already in the workshop. She said she needed to tell me something, and she asked me to listen, without asking questions, until she was finished." I looked at the table for a moment, remembering the quality of her voice that morning. Steady and unhurried, the way it always was, when she had already worked through everything she needed to work through and was simply delivering the conclusion. "She told me someone would come to Patty's on a Friday night. She said I'd know him by his dog and by his hands." Sawyer didn't speak. "She told me to sit still and trust the man with the dog. Whatever happened, don't sign anything and don't stand up." I looked at him directly. Those were her exact words. I wrote them on the back of an envelope and kept it in my jacket pocket for 4 months. The expression on his face was something I didn't have a precise name for. Not shock. He had known Elaine for 4 years and had presumably learned not to be entirely surprised by the reach of her preparation. Something more personal than shock. The look of a person hearing for the first time the full shape of something they had only known in part. He looked down at his hands. They were still resting on the table, between us, palms up, fingers open, the same position they had been in since he first sat down across from me hours ago. He looked at them the way you look at something that has been doing its work without your full awareness of it, with a kind of recognition that arrives late, but arrives completely. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "She knew Valerie would need to perform in front of witnesses," I said. "She knew that a plan like this only works if the target doesn't know it's coming.
If I had walked in here tonight already knowing everything, Valerie would have sensed it and adjusted. She would have found another angle, another timeline, another approach. I folded my hands on the table. But a confused old man, sitting in a diner, not understanding what's happening to him. That's a version of events Valerie had already prepared for. She performed for that audience all evening.
I paused. Elaine always said the best way to catch a liar is to let them lie in front of witnesses. Sawyer looked up from his hands. Something in his eyes had shifted. The operational steadiness that had been there all evening was still present. But underneath it, something else had surfaced. Quieter, less armored. She didn't tell me that part, he said. That she'd called you. She wouldn't have, I said. She needed you to believe it the same way she needed me to believe it. If you'd known I was prepared, your behavior would have been different. Subtly, maybe. But different enough. I looked at him. She directed the whole evening, Sawyer. She just wasn't in the room for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, with the expression of a man acknowledging the full capability of someone he had already held in high regard. Patty appeared at the edge of the table. She set down 2 fresh mugs, without a word. One, black one with a spoon, resting across the rim, indicating the sugar had already been stirred in. She didn't look at either of us with any particular significance. She simply placed them where they needed to be and moved away the way she had been doing all evening, the way she had probably been doing for 30 years, understanding that some moments require coffee and nothing else. I looked at the 2 mugs on the table. Cooper came to the table a few minutes later. His uniform jacket straightened, his expression carrying the particular settled quality of a man who has completed what he came to do and is transitioning back into the ordinary business of his evening. He extended his right hand. I took it. His grip was firm and brief and said everything that needed to be said about the kind of man he was, one who shows up when asked and does the work without requiring an audience for it. She was something else, your wife, he said. Yes, I said, she was. He held my hand one extra moment, then released it, and walked toward the door, nodding once to Sawyer as he passed. The bell above the entrance rang for the last time that night, and then he was gone, and the room settled again into the quiet that had been its natural state before the evening decided to be something else. I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket. The letter was there, 12 pages, in Elaine's hand, folded twice, sealed with the same care she brought to everything. I had been aware of it all evening, the way you're aware of something you're not yet ready to open. I drew it out now and set it on the table, beside the Bible, beside the cream-colored envelope with the broken red seal, beside the brass key that opened something in a bank in Cookville that I would visit in the morning. I looked at it for a long moment. I knew what I was going to do with it. I was going to take it home to the house that had been too quiet for 5 months, and I was going to sit down at the kitchen table in my own chair, and I was going to place it on the table in front of me, and I was going to read it in the room where she had written it on the surface, where she had rested her hands while she found the words. Not here, not under the yellow light of a roadside bar, with the smell of fryer oil and wood smoke, and the echo of an evening that had taken more out of me than I had expected to give. At home, in the chair that faced hers, I picked up the letter and held it without opening it, feeling the weight of 12 pages, and everything they contained, the explanations, the apologies, the things she had chosen to say in writing, because some things are better delivered when the person receiving them has the time and the quiet to receive them properly. The October air outside Patty's Roadhouse was the kind of cold that doesn't apologize for itself. It came in off the fields with the particular edge of late autumn in Tennessee, clean and direct, carrying the smell of damp earth and dry corn husks and the distant, faintly sweet decay of a harvest that had already finished its business for the year. After hours, under the low yellow light of the diner, it hit the face like a correction, something returning to its proper state. I stood on the gravel for a moment and let it. Sawyer had the truck keys. I had handed them over, without discussion, when we came out the door. The way you hand something to a person you've decided to trust without needing to explain the decision. He opened the passenger side first, and dusk went in ahead of me, flowing up onto the bench seat and settling in the middle with the easy confidence of an animal who has ridden in enough vehicles to have a preference about where to sit. His chin found the dashboard almost immediately. I got in. Sawyer started the engine. We pulled out of the gravel lot onto Route 40 and headed toward Cookville. Neither of us spoke for a long while, and the silence was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have said enough for one evening and are giving the words room to settle. Outside the windows, the headlights carved the familiar corridor through the dark, and on either side, the bare cornfields ran flat to the horizon in both directions. I had driven this road hundreds of times. I had driven it in harvest season and mud season, and the dead of January, with ice on the shoulders and the heater working harder than it should. I had driven it with Elaine in the passenger seat and without her, and I knew every curve and every county road intersection by feel. It looked different tonight. Not the road itself, the road was unchanged, but the fields on either side of it, which had felt for 5 months like an obligation I wasn't sure I was equal to, looked like something else now. They looked like mine. Not in the legal sense, they had always been mine in that sense. In the older sense, the sense that means you belong to a place as much as it belongs to you, that the relationship runs in both directions and always has. She described you the same way in every single letter, Sawyer said. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were on the road, his hands easy on the wheel. A man who stays. 3 words. I held them the way you hold something small and dense that turns out to weigh more than you expected. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to add. The farmhouse came into view through the windshield as we turned up the drive, the kitchen light still burning, the way I had left it, casting its familiar yellow rectangle across the dark yard. We went inside without ceremony, the way people enter a house they've been in enough times that the threshold doesn't require acknowledgement. Everything was where I had left it. The half-finished glass on the counter, the chair pushed slightly out from the table at the angle I always left it, the calendar on the wall showing October, the days crossed off in my handwriting up through the 24th. But the room felt different. I noticed it immediately and couldn't have explained it to anyone who hadn't been in both versions of it, the room as it had been this morning and the room as it was now. Something had shifted in the quality of the air, the way air shifts in a house when a window has been opened and then closed again. The same room, changed by what had moved through it. We sat at the kitchen table. We sat there from sometime after 10 until the numbers on the stove clock had worked their way around toward 4 in the morning, and we talked the way people talk when they are filling in the outline of something that had previously only existed in pieces. He told me about the letters, what Elaine had written, in the early ones, tentative and careful, and how they had changed as the months went on, becoming more direct, more herself, the way she became more herself, with everyone she trusted over time. He told me about Nashville, about the work he had found after the shelter, about the foundation she had helped him incorporate in the 2nd year. I told him about her, the things that don't make it into letters because they are too small and too constant to seem worth writing down, the way she hummed when she was gardening, slightly off-key and entirely unself-conscious, the particular expression she had when she was reading something that interested her, the way she had organized the kitchen so that everything had a place, and the place was always logical, and I had understood the logic immediately and never once rearranged it. Dusk slept under the table with his chin on his paws. For the first time all evening, the steady rotation of his ears had gone still. His job was done, and he knew it, and he slept the way working animals sleep when they have finished their work completely without reservation. Around 4 in the morning, Sawyer reached for his jacket on the back of the chair. I watched him put it on. I watched him check the pocket for his keys. I watched him look at Dusk, who opened his eyes without lifting his head, assessed the situation, and rose to his feet with the calm acceptance of an animal who understood what the jacket meant. "Stay," I said. "There's a spare room. It's nothing special, but it's— I know, Sawyer said. He said it gently, without apology. But there are other people out there with shadows behind them, Mr. Calloway. Sometimes they need a man with open hands to stand in the way. I stood up. We shook hands across the kitchen table, his grip firm and unhurried, lasting a beat longer than a standard handshake lasts, carrying in that extra beat everything that two people can convey when words have reached their limit. I held on for that beat and then let go. He walked to the door. Dusk went ahead of him into the dark. Sawyer paused in the doorway for one moment, not looking back, just pausing the way a person pauses when they want to give a place one more second before they leave it, and then he stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door quietly shut behind him. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the truck's taillights move down the drive, growing smaller in the Tennessee dark until the sycamores at the road's edge swallowed them. The mist had come up off the fields while we were inside, the way it does in this valley, in the last hours before dawn, and by the time he reached the road, he was already becoming part of it. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. Same blue curtains. Same crack in the corner of the third tile by the stove. Same old percolator that Elaine had insisted on keeping, even after the newer machine arrived as a gift from Valerie one Christmas. I had never asked why she refused to switch. Standing there in the pale wash of first light, I thought maybe I finally understood. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. I filled the percolator, set it on the burner, listened to the slow tick of the heating element, the way you listen to something familiar after a long time away. Outside, the first bird of the morning started up somewhere in the oak at the edge of the yard, one clear note, repeated patient, like a question that already knew its answer. I got out 2 cups. I don't know why I still do it. Maybe I do know, and I've just stopped pretending otherwise. 1 cup black the way I take it. 1 with exactly a single spoon of sugar stirred in. I placed the second one on the seat of her chair and pulled mine out and sat down across from it. It wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't the hollow ache of the first morning or the second or the 47th. It had become something else. A ceremony. A small private way of saying I still remember how you took it. I will always remember how you took it. The letter was on the table where I had set it the night before, still folded the way she had folded it, careful with the corners, matched just so, the way she did everything that mattered. 12 pages. Elaine, Grace Calloway, had never been a woman of half measures. I opened it slowly, the way you open something you've been waiting a long time to understand. Her handwriting was steady throughout. She had written it in the weeks before the worst of it, when her hands still obeyed her. I could picture her at this very table in the still hours before sunrise, choosing each word the way she chose everything, with patience, with intention, with more love than I had ever known how to fully receive. She explained about Sawyer, about a chapter of her life that had closed before I ever knew her, a young woman alone in Nashville, a decision made in impossible circumstances, a child she had placed in the care of others and carried quietly in her heart for decades. She had never stopped looking. When she finally found him, gaunt, struggling, sleeping in a shelter 2 blocks from a bus station, she had stood at the door and said his name. He had looked up. She wrote, "He had my eyes, George. The green ones, you always said, reminded you of the fields after a train. I knew him before he said a word. 4 years of letters, of careful, gradual rebuilding, of a mother learning her son and a son learning to trust that being found was not the same as being claimed. She had not told me because she wanted to protect what we had built, the life, the peace, the mornings, just like this one. She had worried I would feel replaced or deceived, or asked to carry something that wasn't mine to carry. She had been wrong about that, but I understood why she thought it. About Valerie, she wrote plainly and without cruelty. She had learned of the debt through a private inquiry she'd arranged quietly and said nothing about. She had watched her daughter move toward a decision that could not be undone and had chosen to let the truth do what confrontation could not. I am not punishing her, George. I am protecting her from herself. There is a difference, even if she won't see it right away. About Cooper, she wrote only this: "He is a good man who has known us a long time." I asked him to hold the envelope until the right night. He understood without me having to explain. That is a rare and valuable thing in a person. The final paragraph was shorter than the rest. The handwriting was slightly different, a little slower, a little more deliberate, as if she had saved it for last on purpose. "I know you'll be angry at me for a while, George. That's all right. I know you well enough to know you'll forgive me eventually. You always do. That's the thing about you, you stay. Even when staying is the hardest thing in the world." I folded the letter along its original creases and set it back on the table. I did not cry. I had cried in other rooms, on other mornings, when the weight of her absence had been too large to hold upright. This was different. This was the feeling of a man who has walked through a long storm and come out on the other side to find the ground is still there, solid, real, ready to be stood on again. Outside the window, the Cookville fields caught the first true light of morning. The rows of corn, stripped down by October brown and dry, and waiting for whatever came next, looked in that particular light like something that had survived on purpose. That is what she taught me, not in this letter, but in 38 years of small, daily choosing. That love does not finish when the person leaves. It keeps moving through the world, through letters held in trust, through young men with open hands, through envelopes tucked inside old books, through sheriffs who understand without being told. It keeps finding the people who need it. It keeps arriving right on time. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and let the warmth come through. If this story found its way to your heart tonight, leave a comment below. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Some stories are meant to travel. I placed my hand on top of the letter. Across from me, the chair held its cup of coffee, still warm, 1 spoon of sugar. The morning light moved slowly across the table between us. I have never truly been alone.